Good morning, everyone. So, had to jump in this morning. The speaker we had scheduled wasn't able to make it. So, something that's been coming up for me lately in my practice, and I think is kind of an interesting issue as a Zen practitioner, is kind of uh, it's something that's really basic to Zen teachings. Um, and you check to see if he came on. I'm sorry. No. Okay. Sorry. We thought maybe the speaker came on. Uh, and that is the notion of attachment. Uh, and the reason why I think it's such a thorny topic to work with is that when we read the ancient literature, it says essentially what it says is attachment bad, non-attachment good. They don't use the words bad and good, of course, but in many of the Buddha's sermons, or what are called sutras, uh, he talks about suffering and the root causes of suffering. And of course, that's attributed to attachment in one form or another. And I think that when we start to look at it, we realize, yes, that is true, that there is truth there, that anything we're attached to, and it doesn't matter what it is or for what the reasons are that we're attached to it, the seeds of suffering are planted as soon as attachment arises. Why? Because attachment is basically wanting something that we don't have or don't have enough of, or not wanting something that is happening, uh, being attached to something being a certain way and it's not happening that way. And so that also causes suffering. So both the aversion and attraction aspect of suffering are really attributed to attachment in one form or another. So that's true. And I don't think you have to be a genius or even a Buddhist or even a Buddhist genius to, which I'm not one, by the way, but there are some, I'm sure. Uh, I don't think you have to be a genius to see that that's the case. I think anyone could see that. At least I think so. Sometimes it's hard for me to tell what anyone would think because I've been doing this for so long. People say, "Well, what was it like before?" Well, I don't know because I was a teenager before, and we all know what it's like to be a teenager. Dave talked about that a little bit, I think, last week. So there's this notion of attachment bad, non-attachment good, and yet we are humans. And guess what? I think probably all of you realize at this point that it's impossible to live without being attached to things. And of course, from a psychological standpoint, because Western psychology has really entered into Zen and Buddhism in a very substantial way over the last, well, especially the last 20, 30 years, but even since Zen was introduced to the West, there's the notion of different types of attachment, some being healthy forms of attachment and some being not healthy forms of attachment. And I'm sure some of the psychologists among us could describe it in a more concise way, but essentially, uh, healthy forms of attachment are relationships or things we're attached to, and I think it's this term is usually used in terms of relationships with other humans, that relationships that we're attached to that are healthy in terms of the what you could say the karmic effects of it, and that unhealthy attachments in one form or another are lead to unhealthy outcomes or coming from kind of an unconscious driven realm of ourself. So unhealthy attachments could be said to be conscious, whereas unhealthy attachments could be said to be unconscious. So this is our dilemma. The dilemma is we are human, and we are humans practicing a practice which is essentially pointing us towards or guiding us towards a kind of non-attachment. So what do we do about that? What do we do with that? Well, it's not easy. It's really, really not easy. There's many different aspects of how we get attached and why we get attached. And we can be attached to anything. I can be attached to this beautiful kudzu that Russ made years back because I love the pattern of the grain of the wood and the way it feels in my hand and all that. And I don't want any other one because this one's prettier or nicer or I'm it was Russ's. That's true. And there's not many of them that are Russ's that he gives away. So I can be attached to a stick. I can be attached to a plot of land that I call my own. Uh, I can be certainly attached to animals or people. I can be attached to weather patterns. I don't like the humidity in Florida, but that's not true, by the way. I kind of do like humidity to a certain extent, but a lot of people don't. And some of my family members have said, well, I don't want to live in Florida or even come to Florida. It's too humid. Okay. So we can be attached to drier air or humid air or sticks or plots of land, all those kinds of things. And inevitably, of course, and this is another thing that we don't have to be a genius or a Zen or Buddhist genius to know, we will not have these things indefinitely. And the proof of that is that everyone who's come before us has died eventually. Not hard to see that. And yet, even knowing that, we still cling to things that are really, in many cases, utterly unessential to our living or even our living happily. And sometimes the things we're attached to are causing us to suffer and live in more suffering. Now, those kinds of things, we certainly can develop less attachment or non attachment to. Money, that's a big one. Now, down the street from me, there's this giant, and I mean giant Baptist church. And recently they built a even more giant wing. It's like the size of a small concert hall or large concert hall. I've never been inside of it, but outside it looks huge. And so a lot of people had to donate for that, obviously. So, and those people were also probably attached to their money, and yet that particular church has a rule where you have to tithe 10% of your gross income, and if you want to be a member in good standing, the LDS or Mormon church does that too. So they generate vast amounts of money, but I'm sure everyone wants that money at first. Same thing with Zen or anything else, Zen groups, Zen students. It's hard to let go of the money even though we know that in the end that it's not going to help us, we can't take it with us. We can only use a certain amount, and unless you want to, you know, aspire to getting huger houses and boats and cars and all that indefinitely, there's a point we usually get to where we say, well, this is enough. I'm comfortable here. And generally that happens with age more than anything. I'm all right here. I don't need the next bigger boat or newer car. I can wait a few years or I can wait indefinitely to get that newer car because this one's still running fine. So we become hopefully less attached to things that really don't matter. And that's more what I would call the inanimate objects. Now, do we need a roof over our head? Yeah, especially, anywhere where it rains a lot or snows a lot or is really hot, and that's almost everywhere these days. So we need, and it was recognized from an early time that, we needed all these things to practice. But what is beyond that we're attached to, that's a whole nother issue. And that's kind of the area we can work with as far as material things go. Now, when it comes to relationships with people, that's a very different thing. And that's where, there's a whole, and Kelly's spoken on this before, Sensei Kelly's, the styles of attachment that have to do with different psychological states that people have, how they view either consciously or unconsciously their attachments. And when it involves people in relationships, especially, say, close family members, let's say children or parents or whoever, or people we love that are not direct family members, but people we get involved with that we love, there can be very intense attachments there. Uh, and those aren't necessarily unhealthy attachments. However, they do still have the seeds. The seeds are still there for suffering. Now, as humans and as Buddhist practitioners, I feel, at least the way I work with that, is that uh, we realize that we are going to suffer. There is, we go into it understanding that there will be suffering involved when either I leave first or they leave first. Leaving meaning passing on to whatever's next, whether it's nothing or something. To be honest, I don't know for sure. But whatever it is that happens afterwards, there will be suffering associated with that. And yet, uh, I feel that what Zen practice is oriented towards is moving to a place where we're holding that and we're able to embody that, we're able to experience that kind of suffering of loss, and yet not lose the big picture at the same time. So that's kind of what I would call the bodhisattva way, the way of the bodhisattva. So the notion of a bodhisattva is a Mahayana notion, Mahayana meaning it, you don't see it in really early Buddhism that much, but you really find it in the Mahayana era, which developed a little later in India. The notion of the bodhisattva is from this standpoint anyway, is someone that voluntarily takes on human form or takes on what you could say takes on suffering, because suffering is the minute there's a human form, there's suffering in one form or another. Even birth involves suffering of the woman giving birth, and sometimes and also not probably not sometimes, but always the child too, coming into a different place after being held by inside by his or her mother. So the Bodhisattva says, on some level, is agreeing to, yes, I am taking this on. I am going to suffer. I'm going to experience suffering. It's an interesting thing when you think about it, because ultimately, the teaching that I heard about the notion of the Bodhisattva early on was that the Bodhisattva was someone who was in some exalted realm, some samadhi realm or deep awakened realm of, I don't know, floating around in the realm, kind of like early depictions of God floating up in the sky, the Sistine Chapel, so there's God up in the sky. Um, so the bodhisattva is in this realm and is conscious enough to say, oh, down on planet Earth, in this particular solar system, in this little corner of this particular galaxy out of untold billions of galaxies, there's these beings called humans, and they're suffering. Now, is that unlike the beings that may exist on millions or billions of other planets somewhere in the universe? I don't know. Maybe we are unique. We don't know for sure. I think it's doubtful, but who knows? But in any event, the Bodhisattva says, oh, I'm going down there. I'm going to be born. I'm going to pick some parents. And I'm going to be born into the human body and I'm going to experience suffering in order to assist all these other suffering beings. Pretty far-fetched when you really think about it. And yet, it's a major tenet, you could say, of Mahayana Buddhism. I mean, the Buddha does talk about bodhisattvas, but this notion of the bodhisattva, I think, is developed to a large extent later on. So you could say, and the way I look at this notion is not necessarily that, but more that from a psychological standpoint, we can be in a kind of a samadhi realm. Uh, you could even be uh, in a disassociative state, or you could be just in a state where you really have gone through lots of practice and you're in this samadhi realm. You're not really feeling a lot of suffering, maybe hardly any, maybe none that you can even identify. I think most of us have been there at one time or another. And then you're agreeing to, or you're willingly taking on the attachments that lead to suffering in order that you can teach. But really, I feel what it gets down to is unless you've experienced suffering yourself, you cannot understand what other suffering beings are going through. You just can't. I think that it certainly as humans, the thing that I've noticed about myself and others is that if someone hasn't done something or experienced something, it's virtually impossible to fully understand what someone else experiences when they go through that similar or same thing. And perhaps we never know exactly if it's very likely true. In other words, what it feels to me when I put my hand over the candle flame, which I'm seeing on the other hand, on the other side of the room, is probably not exactly what it feels for someone else to do that. And yet, we know what it feels like to be burned or close to be burned. And that's pretty universal. It's universal among all animals and plants. How would someone who's never experienced that know what it feels like to be burned or almost burned? They just wouldn't. They would maybe know, oh, this person's yelling and screaming, so obviously it hurts and it's painful, but they wouldn't really know the suffering of being burned until they experienced it. And so this notion of the bodhisattva of taking on those kinds of attachments which lead to suffering is has really powerful psychological ramifications because it means that we're fully being embodied as a human in whatever comes our way, whatever comes our way. And at the same time, and this is where I think the Buddhist practice and the Zen practice really comes into it, not creating additional on top of what we need, not need to, but what we just go through as a matter of course of being in a human body. So as little as possible additional suffering that we're creating because of things we're unaware of, essentially unconscious parts of ourselves, which are running in the background, causing us to do things that do create suffering for others, sometimes for the planet in general, but certainly for other humans or animals or whatever. Not thinking that we can free ourselves entirely from it and still be human. If we were able to do that, we would not be a human. I don't think that we can be human and not experience suffering. We can free ourselves from many of the forms of suffering that are created internally and externally because of lack of awareness of unconscious patterns. We can certainly free ourselves of a lot of that. However, there seems, at least to me, after more than 50 years of doing this, that there's more. There's more. I wish I could say, I honestly wish I could honestly look at everyone and say, I'm freed of all this kind of stuff, but I cannot even come close to saying that. Is it better than it used to be? Yeah, it's a lot better than it used to be. But I'm human, and sometimes more is created, or sometimes I realize things that I never saw before. I mean, that happens all the time for me. I realize things that I didn't see clearly after 54 years of inquiry. I'm not sure that I will ever or anyone can get to a place where there isn't the potential to find more or to be activated by something else and look at that and say, oh, I'm being unconsciously activated. Perhaps there are the perfect people or beings of some sort that don't experience this, but I haven't met one yet. So maybe this is a good time to open things up in case there's any discussion about this notion of attachment and how we practice in the midst of our human attachment, uh, but yet minimize suffering in the ways in which we can. So thank you, everyone. Anyone have